You could have a tiny little furry human in your house right now and you wouldn't even know.
Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of House of Bards. We were going to do a different topic for this podcast, but there was a problem with that. There's actually a particular event in our games on Mondays that we're waiting to pass before we start talking about this, because it will provide a lot of the material.
Yeah.
And as some of you may know, the Monday before the Thursday we're recording this on, there was a international Skype downage. Like, the whole of Skype was not functioning properly, and essentially the game on Monday didn't happen because we weren't able to get everybody into the Skype call. So, with that in mind, we're instead going to do a topic that I didn't necessarily want to do this soon after the End of the World episode, where I did talk a little bit about this, but we're kind of running low on topics in the tank, so, if you really like the podcast, one thing that you could do is, recommend us topics to talk about, because it's always kind of difficult coming up with stuff.
Yeah, otherwise we will really be scraping the bottom of the barrel. It'll be me buying choose-your-own-adventure books, and we just sit here for 3 hours and play them.
I actually have one of those, with me right now. I can't remember which one it is, but I think it's one of the good ones.
Yeah, so...
I'm pretty sure it's House of Hell, actually.
Oh.
Or something like that.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yes, anyway, so this is perhaps going to be an angrier episode of the podcast than normal, because I have strong opinions about this matter, and Beth has a lot of notes, some of which are about comics, so...
Yeah. Well, I don't need notes to talk about comics. I could go off on the fly about comics, but there's a good amount of material that I've prepared, so hopefully we'll be alright.
So, yeah, this episode is about cynicism versus idealism.
Which is the kind of a particular worldview. A cynical story and an idealistic story are two very different themes and worldviews that you're presenting. Note that idealistic stories aren't necessarily always saccharine or goofy or silly, and cynical stories aren't necessarily always serious.
In fact, it's kind of a weird, false binary, because obviously somebody can be idealistic about ideals that conform to a cynical worldview.
And, a story...
That would be horrible, and I wouldn't want to meet a person like that. Yeah. But it could happen.
Yeah, but, a story can have a cynical view on things like governments and institutions, but have a very idealistic view on humanity. We would generally regard Harry Potter as being quite an idealistic series, even though J.K. Rowling doesn't have a lot of faith in things like mass media, the government, and stuff like that.
And also that, when you start analysing Harry Potter, you realise that it actually has a very cynical view of the world that it has created, especially in the later books. There's a transition from this idealized perspective of this world that's like ours, but magical and wondrous, and then in the later books you realize that there's actually quite a lot wrong with the way that people relate to each other in the wizarding world. That there's a colossal amount of inbreeding because of the small number of people who actually are wizards.
Yeah.
And the culture itself is stagnating and is critically in need of some sort of progressive influence that it isn't getting.
Yeah. But on the uphand of that, she's very idealistic about humanity and humans and love and the empathy that, people can do a lot of good in the world if they choose to do it. A lot of young adult dystopias are quite similar. They don't have a lot of faith in the government, but they do have a lot of faith in teenage girls. So there you go. So it's not, cynicism. So it is a false binary, and it's a sliding scale of cynicism and idealism. Truthishly, no, it's the sort of idea of it's not quite what we mean. No, it isn't.
What we mean is that there are two sort of polarized opinions generally, or at least two extremes on a continuum of opinion about the way that certain kinds of stories ought to be told, ideally. Which can cause a lot of infighting between the kinds of people who like to, indulge in those stories, and that's going to come across sometimes at the table. What we're saying is this episode is going to be about your position on that scale and what to do about players who are on a very different position on that scale.
Yeah. So,
hopefully.
Yeah. One of the things is when either you as a creator or you as a viewer enter into a narrative, there's kind of there's an implied contract about your expectations and what you should want from a particular series. So, in this instance, we're going to be talking about the creator is the game master and the viewer is a player in this instance, which will change things, but we'll talk about that a bit later on.
The game master is assumed in our model to have created the game created like the the setting or whatever.
Yeah.
But this will also apply to a lesser extent if you are a DM choosing pre-made modules, because a lot of pre-made modules, particularly I would say for 3rd edition and to a lesser extent 4th edition, because those had open game licenses, and as such there were a lot of third-party modules made as well as like the range of Wizards products, which means there's a huge variety in tone, as well as a huge variety in everything else on what kind of thing is available, and so there can be a lot of controversy about like what's produced. In 5th edition we're kind of going to have to see, because there's not a huge number of modules out yet, and all those that have come out obviously are either the ones made by Wizards or potentially illegal distributions of fan-made modules.
Yeah.
Or non-illegal but critically unhelpful distributions of non-setting specific modules.
Yeah. So, but it's sort of, as a viewer, you would expect a very different thing from, for example, something like Attack on Titan, which is of a more serious tone and is of a slightly more cynical worldview, but I would argue that the particular fandom misunderstands Eren as a character, and actually it's a very optimistic series. But to something, say, like early Naruto, which is very optimistic, very idealistic, very typically within its genre. So there are expectations you have about certain things. This is why a lot of people don't mind characters dying left, right, and centre in Game of Thrones, to the point where it probably drives the fandom mostly to apathy, I feel. But in a lighter series, characters that start good characters who you think, why are they dying? They seem to be dying for no reason. A fandom might get angry, and you might see the same people have very different reactions to, say, a death in something like The Walking Dead to something like Harry Potter. I don't give a shit that Ned Stark's dead, but I'm really angry Fred Weasley's dead, because it was 2 different series and the deaths were 2 different things.
There was a different expectation set up by the contract as to what the meaning of those things would be.
Yeah.
That's very, very common.
Yeah.
And naturally that is going to come into the kind of game you run, even though it's not really what we want to focus on.
No.
Obviously, every week we say that we are the very shared narrative focused, kind of role playing. That's what this podcast is about, and obviously that includes a lot less in the way of character death than meat grinder scenarios would.
Yeah.
Or tournament scenarios. Do they still do those? I kind of feel that they probably don't. That was like an AD&D thing. But tournament scenarios still exist, and I believe that many of them have been converted for newer versions of the game.
Yeah.
But those tend to be a lot more brutal, because there's an expectation going in that they will be.
Yeah.
Whereas the kind of campaigns that we make, there's kind of an expectation that you will be at least given an opportunity to try and form a character, and that there's a non-zero amount of labour in making a good, memorable PC that is... Like, it shouldn't be that PC can't ever die.
Yeah.
But if you're going to put that much labour into that, that endeavour, then you need some kind of assurance within the contract that the DM can't, dash all of that labour, completely. just on a whim.
Yeah, I am actually reminded very much of, perhaps in contrast to your world, there's a show that I like to watch a lot called The West Marches. And that is it is quite a cynical world because the nature of it means that it's much more open and characters can kind of just go anywhere and do anything. If you watch the show, you'll understand kind of what I'm getting at here, but a lot of the time characters do die. I think the very second session they ever did was a total party kill. And it has kind of like a revolving cast, so there's different characters each episode. So if you're getting into like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that, it's probably not a bad series to watch and it'll probably get you pretty excited because you kind of get to see the range of different characters and different people coming through each kind of week and doing different things and different quests, as opposed to other ones where you kind of have to sit down and, but sometimes it ends with someone dying or everyone dying. And sometimes when it's someone who's been on a few weeks in a row and their character dies, it can be a bit gutting. I remember there's one particular character that dies, I think, in her third session of appearing. But I think it was probably something like week 7 she died. And everyone was absolutely gutted because she was like one of the best characters and she died. But that was those players entered into a world knowing, okay, this is going to be a bit more meat grindery. This is going to, you might not make it out alive necessarily. It's very easy to die in this campaign. And that was something that they agreed into. So, yeah.
Consider also that the expectation of the frequency of death inherent in the contract will change depending on the system that you're working in.
Yeah.
For instance, it is expected that in Dungeons and Dragons, the capacity for player characters to die at any given point is quite high, whereas if you're playing Traveller, because that's not the focus of the game, it's less likely, and therefore less frequent. In the World of Darkness, it's even less frequent, Mage especially. Like, that's supposed to be the real world.
Yeah.
So death there is infrequent and as big a deal when it happens as the equivalent death in the real world would be. It's like, if somebody dies in the World of Darkness, you don't chalk it up to shit happens. It's like, at the very least, if you can't cover it up, the police are going to be there.
Yeah.
I mean, probably it's going to be, like, on the television, like on the news, that you were straight murdered. Maybe there'll be, like, mysterious circumstances. I mean, I presume, like, at higher levels, mage and vampire and whatever have means of covering this shit up, because, presumably there would be more awkward questions if they didn't, but it's like, that kind of secret world stuff means that there will be real world consequences of character death when characters do die, and that kind of messes up the whole secret world conceit if that happens really, really frequently.
Yeah.
Because it's very, very difficult to hide your secret world behind, like, the veneer of real life that we are all familiar with, and which is why it can be used as a centralized storytelling tool if, like, people in that veneer are mysteriously dying all over the place.
And you have something like Apocalypse World as well, where it is quite easy to die, but it's because the nature of Apocalypse World is much more joined narrative-y. It's almost like you kind of go along with it and you make the story up with the game master as you go along, where it's like, oh, actually, I feel it would be appropriate for me to die here. Or I might not want my character to die, but if they do die, I guess it's okay. It's a weird system, but it is very easy to die in Apocalypse World, particularly in the apocalypse scenarios you do.
In Call of Cthulhu, which is kind of a strange one, death is infrequent but practically guaranteed. It's like you're not gonna die a huge amount, but it is almost guaranteed your character will either die or go mad.
Yeah.
Possibly both. Like, that's an expectation that you go into the game with. Even though characters might not be put in lethal danger as frequently as they are in something like Dungeons & Dragons. I don't know, like, Call of Cthulhu is a strange one. But, yeah. So what I'm saying is, obviously the scenario will change players' expectations going in as to, like, what kind of frequency death is going to come at, but also the setting, the actual system that you're using. On the cynical end of the scale, you have things like The Walking Dead. and Game of Thrones, and actually mainly those two things. Give me another thing. What's a third thing?
The continued grimification of comic books in general, particularly DC comics, do this a lot now.
Yeah.
Avengers Arena is a really good example of this, actually. Avengers Arena was where they decided that they were going to copy things like Battle Royale and the Hunger Games and put a load of teenage superheroes into a big death arena and have them fight to the death. And it was a bit like, really? Because I'm not sure it really fits any of these characters' previous stories. But we'll probably get back on that, but continue your point.
That's the cynical end. The cynical end posits that the game is supposed to be a simulation of real life, and even though real life does not have the fantasy scenario portrayed there, the human beings and human proxies, because all sapient non-human races in Dungeons and Dragons and other games are human proxies. In fact, 90% of all non-human sapient fictional beings posited by humans are proxies for humans.
Yeah.
Because, weirdly, we are the only sapient species in existence as far as we know, so it's actually really, really difficult for us to create fictional sapient beings that are completely unlike us, unless you just sort of cop out and make them completely unscrutable to us.
Yeah. Although, and I think even if we did, even if there were other species like us, other species that had our level of sapience, I don't think we'd necessarily recognise it because they live in such a different way
absolutely.
to us,
and
possibly.
I'm trying to find some way to factor in the fact that I am aware that sapience as a concept is moulded by what we as humans are like.
Yeah.
So we're more likely to find non-human sentience than we are non-human sapience.
Yeah, we look at, say, something like orcas, and they have things like families and, pods, and they're very attached to their families and their kind of particular groups. They're incredibly intelligent, comparable to, I would say human intelligence, which, And
orca are definitely very intelligent.
But at the same time, they're wild. At the same time, we would never really be able to understand it because they live in such a different way to us. Because they live in the ocean and the water, and
we as humans are kind of adapted to our particular ecological niche or lack thereof. So it's quite possible that other animals might be capable of reaching, our particular niche, but they don't because we're filling it.
Yeah.
They have their own niche that they're perfectly adapted to.
Rats can feel empathy and humour, and they dream just like us. Rats could be like little furry people, we just don't know, because they live in such a different way, and they've just filled their own little niche. You could have a tiny little furry human in your house right now, and you wouldn't even know, because you're just so puzzled by the fact that it's a tiny furry little human.
Wow. We are massively off topic again.
We are.
We're not ever going to be able to talk about this. All right. The other end of the scale is idealism. Idealism posits that fiction's purpose is to either distract from or attempt forcibly to alter the cynicism of actual real life, and that therefore simulating real life within the model of the game is pointless.
Yeah.
And actually antithetical to the purpose of the game itself. Both of these are to an extent fine.
Yeah.
Obviously, that they tend to, when they get into extremes, have problems. Like extreme cynicism tends to make the holder dislikable and to cause a collapse of ethics in decisions. Extreme idealism tends to be hideously impractical.
Yeah.
The problem comes when you have a very strong idealist player and a very strong cynic player in the same group.
Yeah.
This will also be a problem if the DM is one extreme and is trying to interact with players who are not, but let's go first with the model that there are two players at a table, one of them is an extreme idealist and one of them is an extreme cynic.
Should we call the cynic Charlie and the idealist Isaac?
Sure.
Yeah.
The first thing that we've got to get out of the way is this. Charlie and Isaac will not like each other.
Yeah.
There's not really, even if otherwise they do like each other, they will not like the characters each other play.
Yeah.
And they will not like the way that the other conducts playing the game. There isn't a huge amount you can do about this. Because as far as each of them are concerned, the other is playing the game wrong. It's like the constant battle boiling away in the Magic the Gathering user base between Johnny and Spike. But particularly over Spike's willingness to net deck. those of you who know what I'm talking about will know that, of course, Johnny doesn't like the fact that Spike is willing to net deck and play well with a net deck, because Johnny considers deck building to be part of the game, and therefore net decking is cheating. But it's still a valid part of the game, which means that there's nothing that can be done about it, and it's just this constant fight between the two of us, while presumably Timmy goes and has fun casting 6-drops.
Yeah. I don't get any of these jokes.
It's funny because Beth doesn't know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah, it's great.
I will maybe explain it to her after we finish recording. But the point is, Charlie and Isaac have very, very different ways of playing the game, and they have very, very different things that they want to get out of the game. Neither of them is wrong, even though, like, if their philosophy carries over into their general life, or if it is reflective of what they want out of their general life, it might cast some kind of light on, whether they're horrible people. But they're not going to you can't do anything about this. Like, you can try and move them towards some kind of central position. You can maybe try swinging Isaac to be, like, idealistic about grittier things in the hope that that will appeal to Charlie. You can try and appeal to some idealistic side of any character that Charlie is playing, because given that Charlie is a cynic, that means that Charlie can play a character with a different set of ideals to him. But ultimately, you can't do anything about the fact that these players are going to make decisions within the game that will anger each other.
Yeah.
For instance, let's think of an example.
To an extent, I think idealistic characters, they're more prone to wanting to communicate and negotiate with things like bad guys or people who are attacking them. Like, a cynic is just like...
Well, there's one kind of idealist who'll do that. Like, some idealists don't, because some idealists they want to play characters who are convinced that their cause is just.
Yeah.
And therefore, they would always kill those that attack them or, otherwise menace them, because they're always wrong. The way to get round this, obviously, is Charlie and Isaac need to get good at role-playing. That's the only way that you're going to find some kind of common middle ground here. Is Charlie and Isaac both need to be able to play characters who are unlike themselves, and that means that they are going to need to have some kind of record on the ethos behind how their particular characters are played. The problem with this is that if you're going to have them, like, frequently build characters who are complex enough that can be done, you're going to have to cut down on the frequency of character death within a setting, and that's going to piss off Charlie. This is a really difficult problem to deal with. It has happened to me as a DM. I have also been Isaac. I'm not going to lie to you. With an appropriate Charlie. And maybe I will tell some stories involving this person when we do the story podcast. What about you, Beth? Have you ever been one of these people?
I don't think... Because in real life, I'm a bit of an idealist, to an extent. But I think I do have a tendency, not Jay, but other characters. I remember a character I played a while back called Kate, and she was quite cynical, but she was kind of meant to be cynical. So she did come into conflict with other characters who were very, idealistic and just, and this is what we do because we're superheroes. And she was very, yeah, but I'm a 90s anti-hero, so I'm not going to have the same view as you are, which works for that genre, to be fair, which is superheroes. Like, that's part of the beauty of things like Justice League and Avengers, isn't it? Is that you have someone like Captain America side by side, someone like Black Widow. You have Captain America.
I like how both of the characters you mentioned are in the Avengers, not the Justice League.
Yeah. Or, Batman alongside Superman.
I mean, like, those two characters have existed in the same space for so long that it feels kind of weird to point out the contrast between them, but there is one. Like, there's a very heavy contrast between them.
I mean, there's supposed to be, DC, if you're fucking listening right now, there's supposed to be a difference between Batman and Superman, right? Like,
but maybe not
for some
as
fucking
much
reason.
Of one as, like, when Batman is all dark and gritty, because, like, you look at original Batman and he's principled in a way that Superman would probably be fine with, but he's still, like, way, way darker and comes from a much darker place.
Yeah. But, look, it's been an established thing since comics kind of got good as an art form, which is sort of about the late 80s, like the sort of late 70s, early 80s. Because before then, like, you had the golden age of comics, and that's all fine and well, but that was fucking ages ago, so who fucking cares about it, really? Right? Sorry if that's upset some people, but who cares about what happened in the 30s and 40s in regards to comic books, right? They are important in a historical context, in terms of propaganda and what, the sort of comics that were put out. Like, Captain America is, like, his comics are very important to the 1940s, because he was invented for specific war, I'm getting a bit ahead of it. Anyway, the history of comic books with Beth. But, Batman has moved on and he's evolved. And Superman has moved on and evolved. Because Superman, when he was first introduced, he was a bit of a jackass, actually. He was a bit of a dickhead, okay? He was very mischievous. He'd play a lot of pranks. He wasn't necessarily a cynical character, but he was this view on, like, here we have this godlike character. What kind of a god is he? Loki, apparently. Whereas Batman was definitely in the darker world, but he wasn't necessarily a cynical man. He was like, I believe people, and I think to an extent he's always been like that, but Batman is
the
always...
implication that I got, like, looking through the history of Batman, is that Batman was not really a character with a huge amount of levity, and generally he was at his most likable when he was doing the exact same shit he would normally do, but was being forced to do it by people being absolutely awful to him.
Yeah.
It was like... that was the time when you were most on Batman's side, when people were just like being horrendously fucking terrible to him and endangering his life and the people he cared about, and you'd be like, okay, Batman is being the exact same asshole as normal, but I get it.
Yeah.
I'd probably do that too.
Yeah, but it's like, but then like things move forward, and now for some weird reason, and then things move forward, and Batman was a bit more, he was the sort of idealist in a very cynical, horrible world. He was about justice and principally about believing that there is good in people, but he has to go and sort out all the bad people on his own. And that's where the Robins come into it, because Robins are, like, collectively, all of the Robins, even the ones like Damien and Jason, who are a bit more dark, they're about principally being good and idealistic and showing Batman that actually there is hope left for humanity and allowing him to remember that occasionally. So when Batman does maybe meet a, crying little girl, he's not a complete dickhead, and he's like, hey, I recognise that you are a vulnerable child, and I'm going to sit here and comfort you and make you maybe believe in heroes and good things again. Okay, you sorted out, good, let's take you home. Okay? It's nice.
Here's the inherent conflict between cynicism and idealism, and why you can't have too much of one or the other. I want to talk about the Labour Party for a moment.
Okay.
I feel like Beth will probably work out where I'm going with this, but this is going to be a weird part of the podcast. So, as you know, Beth and I both live in the UK. Mm-hmm. And as some of you may know, the Labour Party, which is the current political opposition here, just had an internal election to decide its own leader after Ed Miliband left.
Yeah.
And that leader has been announced to be known socialist Jeremy Corbyn. I am going to explain to you why Jeremy Corbyn won the internal Labour leadership election despite united opposition from all three other candidates. And it does come down to this dynamic of cynicism versus idealism. In the 1990s, Tony Blair became leader of the Labour Party. And Tony Blair's philosophy was that if you had Labour being too adherent to their principles, then Labour would not be able to garner any votes from centrist voters, which would then go to either the Lib Dems, which in that particular point, maybe it just meant they were kind of wasted, or to the Tories. So Tony Blair's philosophy was that by conceding some of the more extreme Labour principles, Labour would be much more likely to win an election and thus be able to effect actual change on, some of the more moderate principles that they had, rather than no change whatsoever because they were always the opposition.
He wasn't technically wrong.
No, that's the thing. He wasn't technically wrong.
Yeah.
In fact, in terms of doing what it's supposed to do, Blairite methodology does, to a certain extent, in most contexts, work fine. The problem is, once they dug in, that became the new normal for the Labour Party. It was New Labour.
Yeah.
And so you've got people coming into the Labour Party as well as people voting for them who are a lot more centrist and a lot more down with this idea of conceding more extreme policies for the actual acquisition of power, which is a very cynical outlook. The problem with this is that once you have that, those people are then willing to make that concession again from their own starting point, because they think, well, you know, my personal politics line up very much with New Labour, but I'm willing to make some concessions to give me more centrist voters. And that will keep happening. So basically, the problem here was that, you know, Jeremy Corbyn was essentially put on the ballot as not a joke, but sort of for him to be like the token socialist there, just so that Labour could improve its image with far left voters, you know, the kind of people who normally jump ship to the Greens. Yeah,
like I heard that he was up for the leadership, and I was like, oh, he's probably going to drop out in 2 weeks.
Well, no, it was actually that I think, was it actually Liz Kendall who wanted him to be wanted to get him the required minimum number of votes to put him on the ballot, just because they thought, you know, well, there's Andy Burnham, Liz Kendall, and Yvette Cooper.
Yeah.
And they were like, we should probably have like a far left old Labour guy, just so that's the, you know,
so that we still
we'll get one
like
of those in.
The same party we are, yeah.
Yeah, we'll get one of those in, and a load of people, a load of the kind of people who normally jump ship to the Greens will see that he's there. They'll be able to vote for him. It'll be a very small number of people, but those people will stay in the Labour Party because they were like, we tried. And then we'll have them as Labour voters rather than losing them to the Greens, and that'll be good in a general election. Then he started winning. Yeah,
and then they shot themselves.
The problem here is that Andy Burnham, who was probably the second most popular, Yvette Cooper and Liz Kendall were all like second generation Blairites, maybe third.
Yeah.
Who's like, they were completely indistinguishable from the Tories that they were scaremongering about because they were willing to sacrifice that much. That was the problem, is that Jeremy Corbyn was an idealist. Yeah. And presumably still is.
Yeah.
That's one of the big worries about whether or not he can win a general election. But he was like actually able to make promises about the kinds of idealism that people in the Labour Party actually wanted. Because people were like, when the party has become so cynical that it's willing to, you know, basically sell out anything for like the most foundational policy, like there's no reason you wouldn't just vote for the Lib Dems.
Yeah.
I mean,
other than the fact that they're spineless and
but it's like if everybody moved to the Lib Dems, it's like no, that's the point. It's like Blairite Labour was not able to make any promises that it wouldn't be as spineless as the Lib Dems. Like that was the thing. Like it had painted itself into a corner, so of course the idealist won.
Yeah,
but that's just like pushing the metronome back the other way, because of course Blairite Labour came in for a sense of practicality when there was too much idealism, and now Jeremy Corbyn has gone into power because idealism is pushing back against completely bland, cynical practicality.
Well, it's cynicism and idealism, they're very much it's a cycle, isn't it?
Definitely. I think
you see this all the time within genre. At the minute, we're on a very cynical kick in terms of media, I think. There are some pushbacks against it, like I would argue the Marvel Cinematic Universe is fairly idealistic in regards to heroes and what they can do, versus...
I think it always tries to remain that because it was aware that was what it was profiting off.
Yeah.
Especially when the Avengers came out, or Avengers Assemble, as nobody calls it in this country.
Yeah. But, and then, you are going to get this, and they have said this repeatedly, the Justice League cinematic stuff is going to be quite grim and quite gritty, and everyone collectively groaned because DC police stop, it's not the 90s anymore. But eventually, even in the DC comics, you are seeing this slight pushback against the cynicism and the grim darkness that's taken over lately. And you've got series like Batgirl and Gotham Academy, and even weirdly Secret Six is quite idealistic for, a series about criminals. And you have this sort of pushback against all of the grim darkness of the New 52. I'm sure there's some more examples as well of
I've
slightly
seen
more.
Quite a lot of like pop film critics who talk about like cinematic adaptations of superheroes specifically as this director and this scriptwriter are embarrassed to be attached to a superhero project.
Yeah,
and
the Fantastic Four. Yeah,
like it's definitely the issue is that you can't let a superhero film be a superhero film because for some reason that is embarrassing. Like, for a while there was that massive trend, especially in like superhero television, of making characters not use their character names.
Yeah.
Instead, whenever possible, they would be referred to by their actual names.
Yeah. Well,
including like in some like origin films, not even assigning the superhero identity to that character at all.
Yeah.
Just have them use their real name all the time because it seemed more real than having a costumed character dress up and be flamboyant and ridiculously idealistic. And it's like, I kind of get how maybe in DC there's more of a pushback against that than Marvel, because like Marvel did quite well off that, I think, previously, whereas DC, like, you think of ridiculously, like, hilariously over the top idealistic figures. You think of Adam West's Batman, or if you want to be a little bit darker but still ridiculously idealistic, the more recent Batman films. Not like Christopher Nolan's ones, but the ones before that.
I was going to say Christopher Nolan Batman movies are really cynical.
That's why
that's why he's Superman shit, because he doesn't understand Superman. But no, it's like that kind of thing, isn't it? It's God, what was my point? I mean, you had that moment in not just sort of before Iron Man came out. And we'll kind of ignore Blade, because that was, well,
I mean,
not Blade Trinity.
To
that was
ignore
awful.
Blade, because everybody ignores Blade.
Sorry, we won't ignore. We'll hold Blade close in our hearts, but we will ignore.
Blade is not relevant to this discussion.
Yeah.
I get you. Okay.
Apart from Blade, but Blade Trinity wasn't bad because it was grimdark. It was bad because it was bad. There is a difference. But you had, a lot of movies like. Not the Fantastic Four that's just been, but the Fantastic Four.
The one with Chris Evans in it.
Yeah.
Who is the only person that anybody remembers from that Fantastic Four franchise, despite the fact that, he was the third most important character at best.
Yeah. Well, I would argue, actually, that, like, even, you know what, we'll talk about, it's not relevant, anyway. When has that stopped us? But and that was quite, like, Fantastic Four, Rise, that was quite grimdark. The X-Men movies were getting progressively more grimdark and shit. Did I mention the Daredevil movie? Because that's grimdark and awful. And they were grimdark.
I remember that the Daredevil movie existed. I know absolutely nothing about it.
Yeah. And they were grimdark, and they were dark, and they were gritty and angsty, but they weren't very good because of it. They weren't angsty, they were kind of wanksty, if that makes sense. It wasn't like actual kind of darkness and matureness. It just sort of felt like a 14-year-old kind of you're 14-year-old having their emo phase, essentially, not an actual kind of person who's been through some shit. Like, if you compare the Netflix Daredevil TV series, which is dark, but it is infinitely superior to the Daredevil movie, even though tonally they're kind of similar. And it might be because the Daredevil Netflix series isn't that overwrought. It's not that bad when it comes to the religious symbolism. Or it does it, but it does it clever. But, you have this sort of, superhero movies must be cynical and they must be dark. And then you kind of had Iron Man come out and they would go, actually, maybe they don't have to be. Maybe they can be something else. And maybe they can be a range of kind of worldviews per movie. And you can have something like Iron Man, which is about what one man can achieve. And you can have something...
The thing is, like, Iron Man was about a very cynical character growing to become a very idealistic one. I think, like, maybe the main problem was that all three Iron Man movies were about that.
Yeah.
It's like he would get reset for every one, but it's like, once they... And I actually would not even say that this began with Iron Man. I think you have to go all the way back to Spider-Man and the success that they were having with not taking that too dark. And, of course, the tragic failure of trying to make Spider-Man grimdark in Spider-Man 3.
I know. Which, it's not to say that Spider-Man isn't occasionally a dark character. The black suit Spider-Man is a thing that happened. It just didn't happen the way it did in that movie. Like, in the comic books, it was good, and did not involve a emo haircut and an embarrassing dance scene, and all kinds of other weirdness and ridiculous. Like, God, Spider-Man 3. Spider-Man 3 was also very weird because it was about them trying to please everyone and pleasing no one.
Although I would actually recommend that if it's still online somewhere, that you all watch that episode of whatever exactly which one of Movie Bob's shows for The Escapist he did it for, where he defends Spider-Man 3. Because I don't know necessarily if Spider-Man 3 deserves to be defended, but he brings up a couple of fairly good points about the movie's portrayal of Venom and how, like, the bad things about Spider-Man 3 make sense based on that movie's portrayal of what Venom is like.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think actually a major problem here is that cinema has this issue with mistaking idealism for deliberate avoidance of emotional depth. Because fucking Michael Bay... Now, I wouldn't say that Michael Bay made the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles grimdark, because I don't think he did. That's not quite Michael Bay's style. But there's definitely a need to make that property more cynical and faux realistic. Let's get something straight right here. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles do not have emotional depth. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles are not supposed to have emotional depth. That doesn't mean that the idealism inherent in some of the things that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles do while being very campy, ideally, is, like, inherently connected to that campiness. It's not. It's like, the problem is, I think, for a very long time we've got into this position where very cynical things are very non-campy and have a lot of emotional depth, but only really one kind of emotional depth. And then you've got things copying those things that don't have any emotional depth at all because they've been made in imitation of the other cynical things, but without any real understanding of why those things were cynical.
Well, this is why the Dark Age of comics happened, isn't it? Because you had these fantastic comics in the 80s, like Identity Crisis. Well, I say fantastic. Identity Crisis is pushing it. But you had Identity Crisis. You had stuff like, what was it? The Dark Knight Returns. You had stuff like, even stuff like The Killing Joke and other things that were dark. And Watchmen as well, and stuff that is dark and is quite gritty and nasty and a bit, difficult to deal with sometimes. But at the same time, it was juxtaposed with other things. And then the 90s happened, and they didn't understand what made The Killing Joke good. They just understood that, okay, guns, violence, blood, guts, swearing, sex, drugs, that's what makes this good, because it's edgy. And I'm like, no, that's not the same thing. So then you get 90s comics in their kind of very weird, kind of extreme aesthetic, because they didn't understand, Rob Liefeld didn't understand what made the Phoenix Saga and Age of Apocalypse good. He just understood big guns and lots of muscles.
Wow. Yeah, I think Rob Liefeld definitely understood lots of muscles.
Yeah. Too many muscles. More muscles that should be on the human
I don't
body.
Want to be in my head. But yeah, it's like, if the dominant this is something actually that I've been saying for a very long time, because, hey, spoiler alert, I'm an idealist. If you're going to talk about where I fall on this scale, I am very, very much not the idealist of idealist. I still get annoyed at people who are politically idealist about the impracticality of the things that they say, even as I get annoyed at very practical liberals for the thing, like doing all of the things that socialists say they do that are annoying.
Yeah.
But it's like, the problem I have is that because of this culture of imitation, there's a whole amount of cynical media being produced that is hinging itself on pushing back against an idealistic media establishment that isn't there and
Not
hasn't
anymore,
been there
no.
for 20 years.
Yeah.
And it's like, but they're doing that because that's their understanding of this is what media is like, because counterculture got popular. But then it kept doing what it was doing before because that was what it understood was popular, even when it's like, you can't swing yourself off being dark and gritty if nobody expects you to be anything else. Because that's the whole reason. Like, if your work is too idealistic, then it's going to lack emotional depth, because there are going to be, like, emotional concepts you're going to find it difficult to explore. If it's, let's go to superheroes for a minute, because superheroes are easy to understand. If there is an expectation in the contract between the audience and the creator that Superman is always going to save the day, and any setback that he suffers, even if it is ostensibly serious, can be resolved or done away with. Okay, that's fine. You're not ever going to be able to have a conflict about Superman suffering meaningful loss.
Yeah.
Because that's way too idealistic. This is a problem that Doctor Who had as well.
Yeah.
And that's why some of those properties will make a transition into cynicism. Like, I'm pretty sure that's why that happened with comics.
Yeah.
Because suddenly you've got this whole new range for emotional depth where you can tell kinds of stories about these, like, unrelatable god people suffering very relatable problems.
Well, I mean, to be fair, it wasn't comics' fault that they were kind of stuck to being essentially stories for children, because they
there was
couldn't.
stuff about the comics code and
yeah,
things
they
like
couldn't
that.
they couldn't tackle harder material. Of course, they couldn't tackle something like Robin dying, because superheroes weren't supposed to die. Not even bad guys were supposed to die. There was meant to be no death at all. So you can't have someone like Jason Todd being killed and Batman having to suffer loss and recover from it, and you can't have someone like Tim Drake come in again and teach him, actually, no, it's still okay, there are still people who love you and care about you, and, you know, death isn't the end for... And indeed, it wasn't the end for Jason Todd, because he came back. But, you know, it's that kind of thing. You couldn't have a lot of death in comics because they were meant to be for children, and of course children can't handle difficult things. We know that's bollocks, they can.
Unless those things are meted to them in a very controlled environment in this very special issue of something with characters you're never going to pay attention to again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why cynicism happens as soon as those restrictions are taken off, because where we've got all of this new emotional depth, we can make these characters relatable because they will suffer real actual loss that real actual human beings have, and that's good because it shows that there are limits to them and the limits make the characters more interesting. Cool. Fine. When that becomes the standard, suddenly you've got characters constantly suffering real-life relatable losses, which is still happening as this pushback against an imagined enemy.
Yeah, you know, it's... As well, especially when you have a heavily cynical series, like Game of Thrones or The Walking Dead, and that this includes, you know, other things as well, I'm sure you can think of many at home. But when characters die, or when bad things happen to characters, you become very unemotional to it. You become very non-reactive. You kind of go, oh, well, you stop caring, because you expect horrible... Like, you know, I think there were probably a lot of... Like, the Red Wedding, when that happened, was absolutely shocking, because to an extent, you didn't really expect all of those characters to die there and then in one big scene. That is something that was... Legitimately, it was quite shocking. Later on, you have, you know, later on in the most recent series, you have Jon Snow getting basically stabbed by literally every member of the Night's Watch in what is quite honestly a ridiculously funny scene, right? It's absolutely fucking hilarious. I can't watch that seriously. And I'm wondering, if this scene was earlier on, maybe if this had happened in like season 2 or 3, although it wouldn't have made sense it happening to Jon Snow, but if it had happened then, would I have been more shocked? Would I have found this shocking? You know, but because I've had, you know, 5 years of, oh look, now it's time for, like, every character you care about to die. Oh well, you know, and I can't bring myself, like, Game of Thrones constantly introduces new characters. I can't bring myself to care about any of them.
Because you know there's no security for them.
Yeah.
It was the taking away of the traditionally understood plot security, the subversion of the contract that made the original Red Wedding shocking, right?
Or even Ned Stark's death, you know.
Or even Ned Stark's death, yeah.
You know, anyone can die isn't necessarily a bad trope, okay? But I mean, this is the thing about video games and tabletop games that have cynic and idealistic things. We're going to notice these things a lot more than as passive viewers because we're interacting with the world and the characters. We're going to notice these things because we have agency about where the story goes, and we do feel a degree of responsibility as players to what happens. So, to get a bit serious for a minute, although this episode's been... I mean, this episode hasn't been serious as much as it's been whiny, but... As a dungeon master or a game master or a whatever, or even as a game dev or a writer who writes something where people are going to be interacting with the story to some degree, we're going to feel responsibility for the things you make us do and the options you lay out in front of us. Like, and perhaps that's why people love... I mean, that's one of the reasons why people love video games and why people love role-playing pen and paper RPGs and stuff like that is because we have a degree of agency about where the story goes and we feel responsibility for the actions of our characters. But it is important to remember that if you make a world where nobody can be saved, where, you're constantly looking out for missing people, and by the time you get there, they've died and you couldn't save them anywhere, we're going to feel a bit run down. We're going to feel like we can't succeed at anything. Okay, we might get to have cool fights. We might get to defeat a dragon, but we didn't save the princess,
You know Dark Souls?
Yeah.
You know how fans of Dark Souls, who want you to like Dark Souls, always make a point of stressing that, yeah, it's hard, and it's dark, and you'll die a lot, but there's never really a point where, like, you get cheesed into a death where you couldn't have prevented it?
Yeah.
That's really fucking important. Because
Yeah.
that sense of agency is what makes it not bullshit that you would just not stop. That's the thing. And I mean, of course, like, Dark Souls doesn't really have... It does have narrative, but not, like, a huge amount of narrative. And a lot of it is implicit narrative, which I fucking hate. But other people like that.
Yeah. I mean, unless you're the kind of DM who's going to sit around the table and go, look, guys, we're playing in a very cynical world. It's very dark. It's very gritty.
There's nothing stopping you from doing that.
Which there isn't, which is fine. If you're that kind of DM...
expectations in your players. Like, there's nothing wrong with you starting up and saying, this is the kind of expectation you should have about my game. Like, this is the kind of game that I run. And if you're not cool with that, you don't have to play. I mean... It kind of sounds weird because I'm sort of now kind of like drawing parallels to like advice on healthy consent in sexual relationships or something.
Yeah,
that's just what it sounds like to me. But it's fine because like then everybody knows what they're getting into, and people like Charlie and Isaac might know. Okay, well my expectations don't really line up with what this game is going to be about. So either I don't want to play in this game, or I'm probably going to have a better time role-playing a character who isn't like me.
Yeah. Or even, hey, maybe I'll be allowed to play around with the world a bit. Like, hey, you can be a DM and be like, look, my world is very idealistic, but that isn't always the case. And certainly, I'm the kind of DM who's very kind of bendable to the will of players. So if you want to set out to have maybe more of a cynical character and more of a cynical worldview, that's fine. As well, like...
Thing is, Charles and Isaac will not have, like, any problem playing the kind of character that they are. The thing that's going to piss them off is whether the setting punishes them for it.
Yeah.
For instance, an idealistic setting will constantly try to portray Charlie as the bad guy.
Yeah,
and
or
a cynical
at least wrong, yeah.
Or wrong. And a cynical setting will constantly punish Isaac for ever having any kind of, like, hope that an idealistic outcome could be realised.
Yeah, well...
And both of them will resent you for that.
Yeah. Like, really, this is why I'm an idealist, okay? Without hope, right? Without hope, without beauty, without art, without love, life is meaningless and it's awful, okay? Okay, the world is a horrible fucking place and we need hope, okay? We're already in our apocalypse scenario, and I am your messiah and I will save you, okay?
I agree. I mean, I think possibly I'm a bit more... I'm slightly more cynical than you, but I'm still an idealist in that I would say fiction is about stories. And as long as we're a podcast about a very, very story-focused form of role-playing, we will talk about comparisons to fiction.
Yeah.
And when Charlie and Isaac sit down, Charlie will want cynicism and practicality for a variety of reasons, but if he's a mature adult, then Charlie will want those things because he thinks that those things will be able to give him a challenge. Because when he's sitting down to D&D, D&D is, especially AD&D, is a system by which very idealistic goals are achieved within a mechanical framework that is itself very cynical. And that's the problem. It's kind of in the middle. So people have vastly different expectations based on what they value when they sit down to play. So Charlie knows that characters can die at any time, and he wants the challenge of that. Isaac knows that it's a role-playing game, and you're supposed to role-play, and most of your characters are going to be doing something reasonably idealistic, and he wants to do that. Those are two completely different things, and there is going to be conflict between them. I wish at the end of this podcast we had a better answer for this subject, but we don't. Well,
perhaps we should stop seeing cynicism and idealism as a versus thing, and recognise that idealists need cynics, but cynics need idealists as well,
Yeah.
idealists need cynics to bring them back down to earth occasionally and remind them that, you know, it's not always cut and dry and that there are real shits out there.
And cynics need idealists to remind them of their own agency and to show them a lot of the purpose behind things that they otherwise do quite mechanically.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Like, without idealists, nobody would ever change anything because they would think, well, I'm as an individual can't do a huge amount to affect anything, and I don't really see any convincing change arising because of my actions or even actions that I undertake with other people as a group. And idealists would never really be able to do anything at all unless cynics were like able to show them like the practical applications of their own actions.
Yeah. So what we're really saying here is vote in the Democratic primaries.
I'm not saying that. Keep me out of that American
We're not
shite.
saying that. We're not saying that. It's, you know, but it, you know.
I would say we don't have a very good answer to this question, so probably the most helpful thing that we've said all podcast is talk to your players before you start the game about what kind of game you want to play and what kind of game they want to play, and be prepared to, like, you know, try and make some compromises to come up with something that everybody will enjoy.
Yeah, and at the same time though, do remember that you are a creator and you are an author, and art does change people, and it's a bit weird.
There's no like reason, especially in a very interactive format like a game, that you as a creator have to be this like ivory tower auteur who never listens to his audience. Ken Levine is a knob.
Yeah.
So it's not like, you know, that's the best way to be. You're a GM, sure, and you have your own vision, sure. Maybe you want to stick to that, but also, like, these players are your audience, and you're not going to have a fun time playing your own setting if you're not able to listen to what the people who are playing it with you want to get out of it.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. So, I think this has been House of Bards. I've been Beth. You can find me at Baroness Bamf on Tumblr and on Twitter. Please use the House of Bards hashtag. All one word on Twitter, but 3 words on Tumblr if you make us anything that we might want to see or we might be interested in.
Or if you have a new topic for the podcast.
Yes, yeah.
I have been Alex. You can find me on Cleaver Crummish. That is clever crumb-ish. That is a crumb of bread. On Twitter and Tumblr. Also on YouTube, but, you know, you could just put a comment on the YouTube video if you want to contact us on YouTube. Yeah, we would love to hear that stuff from you.
Mm-hmm. So, well,
yeah. Hopefully, next week's subject will finally be interplayer-character relationships.
Oh, as we call it in the biz, love.
Love episode.
So,
but we will
remember,
have to wait to see.
Very much like the question I posed, but also related to possibly next week, just remember this song. What is love? Baby, don't hurt me no more.
Beth, you fucking dirty memer. No more memes. Get the memes out of my podcast. You did this
I'll
last
never
week as well.
stop.
I fired you last time. You're double fired now.
I'll never stop, Batman. You can't make me.